Hey, I'm Nicole. Welcome back to my channel and welcome to a new 3-part video series all about creative sewing. In this video series, I'm going to be sharing with you some techniques along with some ideas and inspiration for how you can level up the creativity in your sewing. These are specific ideas and techniques that I utilize in my own sewing projects that take them from just average to spectacular. In this video, we're going to be exploring all of the creative possibilities around decorative stitching. Most of us, when we start off sewing, will be very familiar with the straight stitches and the zigzag stitches that our sewing machines do. But more often than not, even most basic sewing machines also come with a range of decorative stitches, some of which can be used purely for practical purposes, but a lot of the time they can also be used for decorative purposes, hence the name. Most modern sewing machines will come with a range of decorative stitching. If this is something you've never explored on your own machine, I highly encourage you to do so. Often you can look at the front of your machine and there will be a dial with all the different pattern selection of different stitching functions. Failing that, you can look at the manual that came with your sewing machine and it will often give you a little guide as to what stitches are available and what they could be used for. To give you some starting inspiration, I'm going to share with you 3 specific ways that I have used the decorative stitching functions on my sewing machine to elevate and add an extra creative touch to my garments. The first idea I'm going to share with you is how you can use parallel rows of different patterns of decorative stitching to create borders or motifs either down the center of a garment or on collars, cuffs, hems, anywhere you like really. It just adds a really cute little boho touch often if you mix up the different patterns and colors, and I'm going to show you specific examples of how I have done this. Here on this top you can see that I've used lots of different decorative stitch patterns in different colors. I created one central panel going down the front of the bodice and also the back of the bodice where there was a pleat. I used a little bit of that motif to also embellish the sleeve hems and also the side seams going all the way from the sleeve down to the hem. This was a really lovely way of adding a bit of colour, a bit of embellishment and a slight ethnic twist to what would otherwise have been quite a plain looking top. Often when I'm deciding on a little motif or design for my decorative stitching, I will use a scrap piece of fabric and just have a go testing out the different stitches, different colour combinations, and just seeing how things sit together. I also love experimenting with different stitches, straight ones, fancy ones, zigzag ones, in lots of different colours and combinations just to see what works. When working with a motif that's going to be central on the garment, I tend to start with the decorative stitch that is going to be in the middle and then work symmetrically on either side going from there. If the motif is on a sleeve cuff, for example, then I can quite happily work from the outside in or the inside out. If you are working with a symmetrical pattern, just use the markings on your presser foot on each side of it to make sure that you're keeping an equal distance as you stitch on either side of the central line. The second idea I'm going to share with you for how you can utilize decorative stitching in your sewing is a variation on the first one, but it's using decorative stitching with metallic threads. Most often I choose gold, but you could use gold or silver or a combination of both or any other metallic or fancy threads that you can use on your machine. I tend to use this a lot around necklines or on cuffs, just anywhere where I can add a little border that almost creates a slightly jeweled effect. I think that is the beauty about this particular technique. By adding little touches of gold or silver, you can almost add little jewelry kind of elements in your sewing. I've mentioned in a previous video of mine where I talked about 5 ways that I elevate my sewing, that one of the ways that I do that is by using metallic thread, specifically gold, because to me gold just adds such a luxe touch and it elevates the garment so much. So now I'm going to show you some specific examples of me using gold or metallic decorative stitching on some of the garments that I've made. Here is an example of a dress where I added some gold decorative stitching to the neckline. You can see that it gives it a slight jeweled effect almost, but it also has a dual purpose of holding down the facing. You can see that I used a very small facing, almost like a bias binding, along the inside of the neckline, which holds this piping in place, and the stitching also helps to hold that down while adding a little element of decoration. I repeated the idea here on the sleeve and also here on the lower part of the dress where the contrast fabric meets the main fabric. You can see yet another example here on this dress where I was attaching this white tassel trim to the top and bottom part of the dress. Instead of using a straight stitch, I decided to use a decorative stitch in this gold thread, which just mimicked and picked up the gold detail here on the trim at the top. So really, it's just thinking about wherever you would put a straight stitch, could it be replaced with decorative stitch to add a little element of difference. When setting up to do my gold decorative stitching, I swap up my threads for this gold thread, and I also use a metallic needle. As always, I make sure to do a little test run first to work out my stitch pattern and width and design before I commit to doing it on the final garment. There's another example using the same idea, another dress I made with the gold piping and the gold decorative stitch detail. You can see that you don't really need a huge amount of variety in the stitches. This was just done with a zigzag and some rows of straight stitching. I repeated that here along the seam line here and also on the sleeve. The third idea I want to share with you for how you might use decorative stitching in your sewing is something a little bit unorthodox. I don't want to say I invented it, but I've not actually seen it anywhere. I think it was just something I had a brainwave about at some point and I tried it out and I really liked it. This one is using decorative stitching to not only add a decorative detail on the outside of the garment, but it also serves the function of finishing off the raw edges of the seams inside. Typically, when you're finishing off the raw edges of a seam on the inside, you might use an overlocker, or if you don't have an overlocker, you might use either the zigzag stitch on your sewing machine or bias binding or use French seams. There are many different ways of finishing off seams on the inside. This is one where you do a double turn of the raw edge on the inside, but you use then a decorative stitch to stitch it down. This will make a lot more sense when I show you examples of the way I have used this technique in some of my recent sewing projects. Here you can see a recent example of a garment that I made where I used that technique to finish off the raw edge of the sleeve seam here on this kaftan dress. This is what the seam looks like on the inside. The first step in this process is to sew our pattern pieces together in the usual way, right sides together, following the seam allowance guideline provided on the pattern. Next, we want to press the seam open, and we are going to fold the raw edge over to the inside. And we'll press as we go. And then we'll repeat that on the other raw edge. Back in the machine, we are going to choose the decorative stitch that we want. Set our machine to that stitch. I usually place my presser foot with the opening directly over the seam, and that helps me to keep my stitching central over the seam. Now stitching from the right side, I am going to run my decorative stitch. So here you can see what the decorative stitch looks like from the outside of the seam, and when I turn it around, you'll see that the decorative stitch also holds the raw edges of the seam nice and neat on the inside. So it serves a dual purpose of adding a bit of embellishment on the outside while taking care of the raw seams on the inside. Here is another example of me using that technique, but attaching it to a patch pocket. These are the bottoms for a pair of dungarees that I am in the process of making. I have these back pockets here which are attached as patch pockets. Rather than use the normal straight stitch, which would be traditional for this sort of construction, I decided to use this decorative stitch here along the top of the pocket, and that just holds down the folded edge at the top, and also mimicked that to attach the pocket to the actual trouser. I chose that because the print here is so busy that I thought it might make quite a more seamless choice actually than using a straight stitch. I also repeated that here along the side seam, and I used another decorative stitch here on the front and back center seams along the crotch line. Well, that's it. I hope you found that useful, and I hope it gave you lots of ideas and inspiration that you can use to elevate the creativity in your next sewing project. Decorative stitching. If this is something you've not yet explored or experimented with on your machine, I highly recommend you do so. I would just start by getting some bits of scrap fabric out and just having a play with the machine. Just go to the different stitch functions, see what each of them do, play around with the stitch lengths, the stitch widths, all the different permutations and combinations of each decorative stitch, and just see what combinations you can come up with. Chances are your machine will already come with enough of a range of decorative stitches that will allow you to get your creative juices going. If you enjoyed this video, please make sure to give it a quick thumbs up, drop me a comment to let me know, and subscribe so that you don't miss out on the next 2 videos in my creative sewing series. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you in the next video.